This is Section 1 of the Residential Resale Real Estate Purchase Contract that we use here in Arizona. This is put out by the Arizona Association of Realtors, and they use this as a boilerplate contract that all agents can use if they're a member of AAR. Section 1 covers the property. It also details who the buyer and seller is on lines 1 and 2. Sometimes on line 2, if you're dealing with a property that is a trust, family trust, well, you're going to have a person signing for the trust, or if the property is in probate and you have the executor of the estate, the seller's name might be different. If you don't know exactly who's going to be signing the other side, there's a little box right here that says as identified in Section 9C. That allows the seller's agent on the other side to fill in the details, especially if they haven't actually put that down in the MLS, which you see is getting more and more common. And this is basic line of the contract. Starts out, says the buyer agrees to buy and seller agrees to sell the real estate, the real property with all improvements, fixtures, and appurtenances thereon or incidental thereto, plus the personal property described herein collectively as a premise. And then we have the premise address. And then you have this line over here. It's called the assessor's number. And what the assessor's number is it's like the social security number for your property. Every parcel out there has a separate number assigned to it. And this is what the county uses to assess taxes. Your escrow office and your title officers are also going to use this when they're doing the title search on it. Next lines you have on here is city, state, your zip code, and the legal description. A legal description is a fancy way of clearly denoting the dimensions of the property that you're selling. Because remember, we're not selling houses here ultimately. We're selling a piece of property that happens to have a house on top of it. And then we add in all the other stuff on top of that. But you are transferring the property itself. Legal descriptions nowadays for most residential areas that you're in is going to be a lot and block. Right? The legal description is going to say something like Lot 12 of Honeyville Estates. And the developer of Honeyville Estates recorded a document with the county recorder that has the formal legal description and then is broken out to the dimensions of where every lot is. You'll also see legal descriptions for larger parcels of land, unincorporated parcels of land. That's called meets and bounds. And those are the ones that are written off like that. Section 32, or it'll be the southwest corner of the Section 32, northeast, da-da-da-da-da-da. And that's why we have so many lines here. And I've seen legal descriptions go into multiple pages, usually with the bigger parcels. 99 times out of 100, if you're using a residential resale, you're not going to have a huge legal description. Although this contract can be used for some places out there in unincorporated areas where you're buying 5 acres of land in an area that's never been, subdivided in. So that covers the legal description. Section 1C is our next section down, and this is the part that the seller's most interested in because he already knows what the property's name is. He wants to know how much he's getting paid. All right, so we have the full purchase price there on line 10. We then break out that full purchase price into various things. First thing we do is we call out the earnest money. Earnest money is the money that the buyer is putting up to protect the seller's interest while they're under contract and to ensure that the buyer is actually going to perform on the contract. And this is negotiable. Some people have a hard and fast, it should always be 1% of the purchase price. Some people say 1% of the purchase price unless you're under 100,000, and then you should always have 1,000. I've seen these as low as 500, and usually that's the kind of contract you're getting from a wholesaler who's trying to get rid of flip your property or anything like that. But the earnest money should be, when you're looking at the seller's side, enough that if you are tied up in escrow for a month and then the seller fails to perform, it will offset your costs of your own mortgage payments, your taxes, utility bills and everything on that. So it should be sizable. Should not be too over the top though. And it should be enough that the buyer could lose if they actually go into default for some reason, lose their earnest money, and are still able to buy a new house afterwards. But that's something you negotiate out. First you have that conversation with your agent, and then you turn around and have that you negotiate with the other side of how much that earnest money is. All right. Next line that comes down, we usually put in, if it's not a all-cash deal, we put in what kind of loan it is. Now, if it was going to be an all-cash deal, you just put one line in here, X amount all cash. Now, I set this one up as if it was going to be a conventional loan. So we have the purchase price up at top at $345. All right. We're putting $3,000 down into earnest money. All right. We're in this hypothetical scenario, this is going to be a conventional loan with 10% down, which means that the buyer ultimately has to borrow $310,500, which is 90% of $345,000. And they're going to have to come in with cash to their down payment, which comes into the next line. Now, the earnest money, if the buyer closes, gets applied to whatever the buyer's costs are, including their down payment. So this number you see here at cash due at close of escrow is not necessarily going to be 10% of the purchase price, because they also have the $3,000 down. Now, for some reason, they had the $3,000 down. They knew they were going to have a closing cost. You could actually write this where the cash due is going to be at 10, perfect 10%, and all the numbers add up. But when you're writing the offer, at this point, you always whip out the calculator, add everything back up, and make sure your numbers work out. And sometimes you'll catch yourself up because you were overthinking the issue. So this line right here, this whole little section 1C, this is the purchase price, and this is how we're paying for it. Next line down there under 17 explains how the earnest money is coming across and where is it going to. Now, personal checks, wire transfers, or otherwise you're going to get that across. Some people might be bringing in a cashier's check. They need to call out how it's going to come across. The buyer is writing this down, how it's going to come across. A lot of people nowadays do not have checking accounts. And if they do not have a checking account, it's really hard to write a personal check. You could use a bank check on that, but having that personal check should be able to write that out. A wire transfer can usually take a little bit longer. There can be some hiccups trying to get that money wired over. And so if you're on the seller side and you see the money coming across from a wire transfer, you're going to want to at least see from the buyer, we initiated the wire transfer. Here's the copy of the receipt that we initiated the wire transfer. And then the next line on this is, where is the earnest money being deposited at? You have two places right now in the contract, the escrow company or the broker's trust account. The broker's trust account is an anachronism from earlier days where the real estate brokerages actually held on to their earnest money themselves, and they put it in the broker's trust account, and then they would disperse it out as needed. Escrow companies have stepped up and stepped into this role where you're writing that check directly over to escrow, and they're holding it in the account that they're eventually going to pay everything out of. So never seen a broker's trust account. I don't think anybody uses these anymore. If they're still in the contract, I do know if I saw an offer come across and I was on the seller side and it was saying broker's trust account, I'd be on the phone with that agent, and I'd probably be on the phone with that agent's broker to confirm they actually had a broker's trust account and what that account number was. So next line on here is if there's an all-cash sale, it's calling out that the all-cash buyer needs to attach a letter of credit or a source of funds. We also call this a proof of funds letter, and stating, I have the money. All right, I can offer cash all day long, but I need to be able to prove I have it, and that needs to come from a third party. It can't just be writing a letter saying, hey, yeah, I have this amount. It can't just be a photocopy of your bank statement. It needs to be a separate document, letter of credit from the bank saying this person has a line of credit that's open at X amount, hopefully above the purchase price, or something from the financial institution saying this person has X amount of money available for the purchase of a home. As an agent, especially on the seller side, if you're seeing these line of credits, if you're seeing this source of funds, you need to do your due diligence, especially with wholesalers and investors, because the line of credit might be written for one LLC's name or one entity's name, and not necessarily the entity of the buyer. Because some of these guys get really crazy on how they're doing all their different, this LLC is going to buy, take title. This LLC has the money side, they're doing it for tax reasons or whatever. So that's something, tiny little box, but you pay attention to these things. All right. Close of escrow comes in the next line, and that is actually the date the deed is recorded and the property is no longer the seller's and is now the buyer's. This is a really, really important date, and there are a lot of things that move around the close of escrow date. So when you're writing an offer, you want to make sure that you are actually giving yourself, either the buyer or the seller side, enough time to get all your obligations in the contract done. Now, I'm doing this right now on the 22nd. I wrote this example out as if I was actually writing an offer today. looking at the calendar, let's say I have a lender and he swears up and down, I can close in 30 days. 30 days, I can get you your loan done. Well, we're writing this offer out on the 22nd. All right. Let me back out we're writing on the 22nd. It's Thursday. 30 days from now is a Sunday. All right. Escrow's not going to be open and the banks aren't going to be open. Funds are not getting wired over that. And so that's why we have another line right here that says if escrow company recorder's office is closed on the close of escrow date, close of escrow shall occur on the next day that both are open for business. So that would at least put our close of escrow to the 23rd. But later on in this contract, we have a line where it states this offer is good until whenever. Right now it's Thursday. If I was writing this offer and I was sending this offer today with signatures, I would want to get the seller to respond to me by Friday at 7 o'clock because I do not want them going into the weekend on it. So we'd be writing an offer saying, you have until Friday to get a hold of us, right? Which would be the 23rd of June or July, right? Which means that's a Monday closing. Now, the other thing you got to remember is once your offer is accepted, if that offer is accepted at 7 o'clock on Friday night, and I've gotten offers accepted at 6:59. I can't call up the lender, and the lender cannot get his side going for that. Oh, we can close in 30 days. So all of a sudden, we're now at the 24th. The other thing that can come along those lines is as that other side gets spun up, it might take 1 or 2 days for everybody to really get going. So even though a lender can sit there and tell you, I can close in 30 days and I just closed a deal in 21 days, you never know what other moving parts are going to be happening in this. Right now, here in Arizona, the one thing that is really screwing everybody up is appraisals. Not so much that the appraisals are coming in wrong with low numbers, but they're coming in very, very late. There's not a lot of appraisers out there. They're getting worked really hard. And a lot of them quit after COVID. I mean, they just got done with it. And so these guys are backlogged and there's a lot of work on their end that they have to do on that appraisal. So, the concept of your appraisal coming in on time is, may not happen. So what I like to do is I will add as many days as possible on, but keep it in that week. So in this case, we'd be writing it for the 27th. For some reason, this was coming up on the 30th or the 31st. Escrow is always slammed at the end of the month. It is a truism. It is a fact of life. Do not talk to your escrow officer unless you absolutely have to at the end of the month. Seriously. They're just going to be absolutely crazy, out of control. They do not have any time. They're trying to get all these things that people are trying to close because people who want to close at the end of the month, so they're not having to make new mortgage payments. They're not having to make HOA payments. They're trying to get that thing done and out of the way. So it makes the last week of the month really, really tight for them. So in this case, I definitely would not just say, hey, let's give them an extra week. All right, instead of 30 days, we're going to go 30 days plus a week. Put it on the 27th. This is the way I do it. Your mileage may vary, but respect your escrow officers. Do not close on the end of the month. So we understand that as close of escrow, something is going to happen. And close of escrow is when the deal is actually done. That is when the buyer gets their keys and they get to open up the door to their new house. That is when the seller gets that phone call from Ray going, congratulations, you're homeless. That house is no longer yours. The deed gets recorded. The funds get sent out. All right. Checks are cut. It's considered a closed deal. And because everything has to happen on that date, our next lines 26 through 28 call out a couple of things that the buyer is responsible for doing. Right? The buyer needs to deliver to escrow company the money so escrow can close into fund. That includes the loan amount coming in from the lender, and that includes their own personal money that they need to make available. There's also, later on, we'll see, they have to have documents signed by a certain time before close of escrow. There's a walkthrough at a certain time that needs to happen before close of escrow. The seller has to make sure that the people can still get in it. The seller has to be out of the house at close of escrow unless you have another agreement saying that you can stay in there later. Right? But the lines right here, 26 through 28, are really calling out to the buyer, hey, dude, you have all of these things that you're responsible for doing to make sure we hit the target date of the close of escrow. And to follow that up, we have a stick, and that stick is the buyer is acknowledging that failure to pay the required closing funds by the scheduled close of escrow, if not cured after the cure notice delivered pursuant to Section 7A, shall be construed as a material breach of this contract, and the earnest money shall be subject to forfeiture. A buyer who does not close on time has the opportunity to lose themselves $3,000 because they did not perform in the contract. That's why that's why we have land. It's really early on in the contract. The buyer has to be doing things to close on this property. Now, one of the seller's obligations, right, and this is covered in the next line, is called the possession. The seller shall deliver possession and occupancy and existing keys and or means to operate locks, mailbox security, and they need to be doing that also at close of escrow. So if we're closing on Friday and the seller's saying, "Oh, I can't get out from till Saturday," that puts the seller in breach of contract. The seller needs to be out. If the seller needed the extra weekend, that's why we come back with a counter, and that's why we start talking post-possession or even pre-possession on the buyer side. And the contract right here, and this is like the first line where the brokers are recommending things. Brokers recommend that the parties seek independent counsel from insurance, legal, tax, and accounting professionals regarding the risk of pre-possession, where the buyer gets to move in earlier, or post-possession, where the seller gets to leave of the premises. And the reason for that is you can have weird issues along the lines of what happens if the buyer comes in early, a week early, because they needed to get out of their apartment or whatever. You let them move in. They haven't closed on the place yet. And then they don't actually close for some reason. Occupants in your house, and you got to go through an eviction process to get them out of there. Same thing with a post-possession, right? Seller is supposed to leave. You buy the house and you find out the seller is still in there, and it's like, our house isn't finished being built. We haven't found a place to move. We're just going to stay here. There was a case out in California that I was reading about a couple months ago where the seller had sold the house 3 months before and was still living there. And because of COVID and because of the absolutely insane eviction processes that California has, those buyers could not move into their house because the seller would not leave. All right. So this is why we're telling you, talk to your insurance company, talk to your attorney, talk to your tax and accounting professionals. All right? You're going to hear these things over and over in this contract. The brokers recommend. That is the contract and the real estate agents, buyers and sellers agents telling you, all right, we're recommending you talk to other people who do not listen to what's coming out of Ray's mouth. All right? Remember one thing about this contract. This contract is written for real estate agents, all right, to protect us and to help buyers and sellers transact a property. And because it's written by real estate agents and for real estate agents, you're going to see a whole bunch of lines in here that basically says it's not Ray's fault. It wasn't me. So that's the first time you're going to see that line. I'll point out the other times in this contract where it calls out on that. So if for some reason you are coming into this contract and you are going to have a pre or post possession close, or you need to have that carefully crafted before you get into it. All your agents need to know. The other side, when you're writing the offer, needs to know. It needs to be right up here up front, and seek professional help when you get to that. All right. 1F, this is the next section down. If there's any other addenda incorporated, which is a fancy word, is we needed to throw on more paperwork to cover issues like that post-possession agreement we were talking about. We're going to check a box right here where it's going to say post-possession agreement. Some of the most common ones you see on these extra addendums that come in is the lead-based paint disclosure for any house built before 1979. You're going to have a lead-based paint disclosure that if you got a good listing agent on the other side, he's already had the seller sign that document. It's already been filled out, and it's going to be on the MLS, so the buyers, when they're coming across, can just pull that document out, sign it, and send it across as part of this contract. The other document out there that you really need to see, and I don't see it as often as I should, and I'm not sure if that's because agents are lazy or because they haven't been trained by their lazy brokers that they need to have this document, is the HOA addendum. The HOA addendum is a separate document, and we're going to have an entirely different video on this thing about all the other great addendum that gets piled onto the contract when I'm done with these, is going to come out and say, when we transfer this property in HOA, who's going to pay the transfer fee? Who's going to pay the disclosure fee? Is there going to be any prepaids that are required? And they're all going to be disclosed, at first, and then the buyer is going to say, and we propose we pay for all these things this way. Seller pays everything, or the buyer pays everything, however you want to write that. But that first part of it where the seller is actually saying, these are the fees going to transfer a house in this, needs to be done by the seller. It needs to be signed by the seller, and it needs to be included in the docs tab on the MLS so it can be incorporated into this contract. This is not something you want to be trying to figure out, 2 weeks down the road, when now you suddenly find out about the transfer fee, or now you finally discover the disclosure fee, or now you suddenly discover that there's, a huge fine on the property. All these things are supposed to be called out on that. So that's what that line is. And this is the first page, and we've already gone through quite a bit here. Next line down, we have these initials at the bottom of every page. That is so the buyers and seller can say, yeah, I read this page. It also is specifically called out that if a buyer or seller fails to initial a page, it's still a contract. So none of that, I didn't initial page 2, so none of page 2 applies to me. The last part of the first section, talking about the property, is where we're actually talking about personal property and what's called a fixture. Personal property is anything besides real property, and that's, furniture is compared to. You also hear the word chattel, but we try to keep away from that an awful lot. All right. But property attached and affixed to the premise is considered a fixture, and that's like your lights, the ceiling fans, the garage door, and the garage door openers. These things. And we used to have a lot of confusion going on with a lot of these things, so we're constantly having to add more and more things to this list. And just because this says including the following does not mean, well, this wasn't covered in that list, so it's not a fixture. If it's attached to the wall with the understanding it became part of the house, then it's considered a fixture. In real estate school, they're always talking about the grandma's chandelier. Buyers look at a house, it has this beautiful chandelier in the entryway, they love the house, they write an offer, they close, they get their keys, they open up the door, where's my chandelier? And the sellers say, that's not your chandelier, that's my grandmother's chandelier, it means a lot to me, it was never included in as part of the sale. And long story short on that story is it ends in what's called a commissionectomy, where the listing agent winds up buying a new chandelier for the buyer, because they failed to follow the seller's wishes by making sure that the listing said no chandelier, the chandelier is not getting transferred. And there's a lot of weird things, on here that seem weird, but actually does happen. Storage sheds. You see a great tough shed out there, next thing you know it's gone. Hey, what the hell happened to the shed? That's getting transferred. Water misting system. The blinds, window treatments, these are all considered, fixtures. If the buyer sees it when they write the offer, they should get it when they get the house. So listing agents, when they're talking to the sellers, and when you are a seller, if you have something that you are emotionally attached to in the house that's attached to the house, you want to have it removed before you start showing it to buyers. Latest ones we've had on this is the smart home devices. All right, Nest thermostats got really, really popular when they were first coming in, and sellers were acting like they could take that with them. So a buyer would buy a house expecting to see a Nest thermostat, and when they bought the house, there would be an old thermostat there. Or just a thermostat still in the box and not even attached sitting right there because the seller was taking the Nest with them. That's why we're calling that out specifically. The other existing personal property that gets included on this is you have the option of saying the refrigerator, the washer, and the dryer. And you need to check the boxes out on these things about the refrigerator, washer, and dryer. Agents get into a lot of trouble when their buyers thought they were getting a washer and dryer. That box was not checked. The buyers still sign the document, even though those boxes were not checked, and then at the end of the day, they think they were supposed to get a washer and dryer. So you always point this out on buy side. Same thing. If you're the seller and you're not selling your washer and dryer, your listing agent needs to know that, and it needs to be marked in the MLS. And if you see an offer comes across, you need to check to make sure that those two boxes are not checked. One of the other things they just added on a couple of years ago was a description. This is so boxes check for the refrigerator, and there's two refrigerators on the property, and one's in the kitchen and one's out in the garage. And you buy the house, you get to the house, it's yours, you walk in there, and all of a sudden that nice stainless steel refrigerator that was sitting in the kitchen has been replaced by the garage refrigerator, or a refrigerator you've never seen before. So they've created a description thing in here. When this first came out, they encouraged that you wrote down the serial number of the property you thought you were going to get. And then they quickly realized that after seeing 7-8 houses, and then the buyer suddenly decide, oh yeah, we'll go with the second house we saw today. If you had not gone through every one of those houses, writing down the serial number on each property, you were not going to have anything put in there. So now they encourage us to go a quick visual description, white, stainless steel, and use the term as seen on MLS if you can see it in the pictures, and in person 7/22/21, or whatever the date you actually were physically in there and see it. This gives you a lot more leeway saying, no, that one, not the garage one. All right. And if there's anything else along the lines, you have boxes and you fill this in. So anything else that is a personal property that comes up, and like I said earlier to the sellers, if the buyer sees it, they might expect it to be part of the sale. And if the buyer suddenly wants, I want that sectional couch, this is all needs to be drawn up, and it needs to be transferred as a bill of sale separately. But as you see right here, when you see letters in bold in the contract or capitalized in the contract, this is the contract yelling at you. Right. And so if there's any additional existing personal properties included in the sale, shall not be considered part of the premise and shall be transferred with no monetary value and free and clear of all liens and encumbrances. That does two things. That lets the lender know that this is, whatever the item is not being transferred as part of, with material value that's affecting what you're actually, the price you're paying, so it doesn't screw up their loan. And the other thing is clear of all liens and encumbrances. That protects the buyer. So let's say, hypothetical situation, you're going through a backyard, there's a huge children's swing set, playground slide setup back there. And you want to get it. And you write it into the contract. All right. And it's going to be on here, no, plus children's swing set and backyard. You do that under personal property right there. You check the box, you fill out the description. Children's swing set and backyard. All right. The loan office, the lender is going to know that they're not lending on the swing set in the backyard. It's just coming along, and it does not affect the value of the house. And the buyer is protected that if they bought that on layaway, or they were making payments on that swing set, it's going to be paid off. Now that's important, because you don't want to be sitting there and have your kids playing on the swing set, and then some guy knocks on the door saying, we're here to repo the swing set because it never finished, got getting paid out on. So that's what that line on there is supposed to be. And then if there are lease items like solar panels, water softeners, anything like that, the next lines, 65 through 67, is telling the seller, you're going to deliver a notice to the buyer within 3 days after contract acceptance of items that are leased, if you have anything leased on there. And then the buyer has, 5 days at that time to disapprove of something. Right? Disapprove is a big fancy word to say, okay, we don't like that. We don't want the house now. So that covers all of section 1. Next time I do this, we're going to be doing section 2 of financing. It's referenced on the very last line that if this is an all cash sale, we're going to skip all of section 2 in the contract. But, next lesson we're going to have is going to be on section 2. Thanks for watching about section 1.